At 4:50 in the morning, the frost on the inside of a car window looks exactly like the frost on the outside. That was the thought Della Marsh had every single morning that autumn, lying across the folded-down back seat of a 2009 Corolla with 211,000 miles on it, watching her own breath turn to fog and settle on the glass. The cold came up through the upholstery and into her spine. She had learned to sleep in a coat. She had learned that if she parked at the far north end of the Ashgrove lot, under the one streetlight that had been burned out since August, nobody walking to their car at dawn would glance over and see a woman curled up where a person was not supposed to be curled up. She had learned a great many things in the last 7 months that she had never wanted to know. 40 feet away, 3 stories up, behind a window with a real curtain, her 7-year-old son was asleep in a real bed under 2 blankets and a quilt, warm as a loaf of bread. That was the whole arithmetic of her life now, and she had done the math so many times it no longer felt like a sacrifice. It felt like a fact. The apartment held one bed. The bed held her boy, and the cold held her every night in a metal box in a parking lot, where she counted the minutes until she could go upstairs, wake him gently, and pretend she had been there the whole time. What Della Marsh did not know, what nobody in that quiet building on Wren Street knew, was that the man in apartment 3B, the soft-spoken one who read paperbacks on his balcony and fixed the laundry machine with his own hands and left a thermos of coffee on her windshield without ever once mentioning it, was not a tenant at all. He owned the Ashgrove. He owned 11 buildings like it. And in about 3 weeks, on a cold morning very much like this one, he was going to step out of the shadows of his own anonymity and watch the manager who had been tormenting Della Marsh discover, in front of 40 people, exactly who had been living quietly in 3B the whole time. When that happened, a woman in an expensive coat would feel the floor tilt under her. But that was later. First, you have to understand how Della ended up in the car. She had not always been a woman who washed her face in a diner bathroom. 2 years before that frozen autumn, she had been ordinary in the most enviable way. She and Sam had a small rented house with a yellow door and a hawthorn tree in the yard, and Theo had a room with glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling in the actual shapes of real constellations, because Sam was the kind of father who would spend a Saturday on a ladder making sure Orion's belt was straight. Della worked the front desk and the books at a dental practice. It was not a glamorous life. It was a whole one. Then Sam got tired. That was the first sign, and they ignore it the way busy people ignore the first sign of everything. He got tired, and then he got pain, and then there were appointments, and then there were the words no family is ever ready to hear delivered in a small beige room. The illness moved fast, faster than the paperwork, faster than the second opinions, faster than the savings. Della left her job to be with him because there was no version of those months where she would have done anything else, and she has never once regretted it. Not for a single second, even now. But the bills did not stop coming when Sam stopped breathing. The bills, it turned out, were just getting started. 11 months after the funeral, the landlord with the yellow doors sold the house, and the new owners wanted it empty. The savings were gone. The dental practice had filled her position, and Della Marsh, 32 years old, found herself standing in a leasing office with a folder of pay stubs from a job she no longer had and a credit history that the funeral and the hospital had quietly set on fire, asking strangers to please give her family somewhere to live. The Ashgrove said yes. It was the only place that said yes. A studio with a single room and a kitchenette and a bathroom with a window that didn't quite close on the second floor for a rent that took more than half of everything she could earn, which made her, in the cold language of the housing people, severely rent-burdened, which is a phrase that means you're always one bad week away from the street, and you know it. She took it. She would have taken anything. She moved a mattress, a folding table, 2 chairs, a box of Sam's books she couldn't part with, and a boy who had stopped asking when they were going home because he had figured out, in the way children figure things out, that the question hurt his mother. For the first few months, they made it work the way you make anything work when you have no choice. She got the morning shift at the Maple Street Diner, 6 to 11, pouring coffee for truckers and retirees and the occasional cop, working for a woman named Lou who ran the place with a cigarette voice and a soft heart she would have denied to your face. The diner job covered the food and not much else. So Della took a second job, the night job, scrubbing and vacuuming the empty floors of an office tower downtown from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, because that work paid a little more and because nobody who mattered would ever see her doing it. And here's where the car comes in. And here is the part that the manager would later twist into something ugly. So it matters that you hear it true. The drive from the office tower back to the Ashgrove was 20 minutes, and the drive to the diner was 20 minutes the other direction, and there were only 6 hours between the end of the night shift and the start of the morning one. Gas costs money. Time costs sleep. And there was a third thing, the thing Della told no one, which was that the studio's lease said single occupancy, and the manager, Bianca Reeve, had made it very clear with a smile like a closed drawer that she was watching the unit, that an adult and a child were a great deal of wear on a studio, that some buildings had policies. Della was terrified, genuinely, stomach-droppingly terrified, that if she drew the wrong kind of attention, if Bianca decided to make an example of her, she and Theo would be out the door before Christmas. So Della made herself small. She made herself quiet. And on the nights she worked, instead of driving the long loop home to sleep 3 hours and drive back, she parked at the dark end of the lot, climbed into the back seat, and gave those hours to her son in the only currency she had left, which was a warm bed he didn't have to share with a mother coming and going at all hours. The problem was Theo. The problem is always the children, in the most beautiful way. A 7-year-old notices when his mother isn't in the apartment in the small hours. So Della did what mothers have done since the beginning of mothers. She built him a story bigger than the truth. She told him she had a special night job, a secret one, watching the sky. She told him that somebody had to keep an eye on the stars and the planes and the satellites, and that the somebody, on certain nights, was her. She bought him a paperback book of constellations from the library sale for 50 cents and a little flashlight shaped like a rocket. And on the nights she was home, she would lie next to him on the mattress, and they would find the shapes through the window. The bent W of Cassiopeia, the lazy spilled cup of the Big Dipper, the bright, unblinking, that was a planet and not a star at all. When you can't see me, she told him, look up. I'm looking at the same sky. That's how you know I'm close. Theo believed her completely, the way you believe your mother at 7. And he slept with the constellation book under his pillow and a little stuffed owl named Pilot tucked under his chin. And he never once suspected that the night job his mother went to was a parking lot 40 feet below his window. There was one other person who knew. He didn't know all of it, not at first. But he knew the shape of it, the way some people can read a situation the way other people read a page. The man in 3B kept to himself. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean, dark hair going gray at the temples earlier than it should, with the kind of stillness about him that made people assume he was either very calm or very sad and stop wondering which. He drove a dented work truck, not a nice car. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation. He had a habit of sitting on his little concrete balcony in the evenings with a book and a mug, looking out over the lot and the rooftops and the strip of sky between them. And he always nodded to whoever passed. The tenants knew him as Adrian. Adrian who fixed the dryer when it ate quarters. Adrian who shoveled the front steps before the management company's contractor ever showed up. Adrian who, when old Mrs. Okafor on the first floor fell behind on a repair the building was supposed to handle, just quietly handled it himself and told her not to mention it. The general assumption was that Adrian was a handyman who lived cheap, and Adrian did absolutely nothing to correct the assumption. The assumption was, in fact, the entire point. The first time Adrian Wolfe noticed the woman sleeping in the gray Corolla, he was on his balcony at 11 at night, and a car he recognized as hers pulled in, and a woman he recognized as 2C climbed into the back seat instead of coming inside. He watched the windows fog. He did not knock. He was a man who understood, better than most, that pride is sometimes the only blanket a person has left, and you do not yank it off them in the name of being helpful. So instead, 2 mornings later, when he saw the same car parked in the same cold spot, he filled a thermos with coffee, walked down in the dark, and set it gently on the hood where she would find it when she woke. No note. He did it again the next week. And the week after. Della never saw him do it. She only ever found the thermos, full and warm, the cap screwed on tight, and she would sit with it cupped between her frozen hands and cry, just just enough before she pulled herself together and went to wash her face at the diner. She thought it might be Lou. She thought it might be a kindness from a god she had mostly stopped talking to. She never imagined it was the quiet man on the third floor who waved every morning and never said a word about anything. He did other things, too, in that quiet way of his. When her left tail light went out, she found it working again 2 days later and assumed she'd been wrong about it. When Theo's bike chain came off and the boy sat crying on the curb because his mom was at work and he didn't know how to fix it, Adrian crouched down beside him without making a production of it, threaded the chain back on with 2 black-stained thumbs, and then, because the kid was watching with his whole face, taught him how to do it himself. They ended up talking for an hour. Theo told him about the constellations. Adrian, it turned out, knew them all, every one by name and by season, where they rose and where they set. He told Theo that his own mother had taught him a long time ago in a building not so different from this one, when he was about Theo's age, and they had not had very much either. Theo asked if his mom was still around. Adrian said no, she'd passed, but that she'd be glad to know somebody else was still looking up. After that, the two of them played chess sometimes on the balcony, the boy and the quiet man, a stuffed owl supervising from the railing, and Della, who came home exhausted to find her son laughing with a neighbor, felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in 2 years, which was the feeling of not carrying the entire weight of a child's joy alone. She should have been suspicious of how good it felt. Things had not, in recent memory, gone gently for Della Marsh, and they were not about to start. Bianca Reeve had been managing the Ashgrove for 2 years, and she ran it the way a certain kind of person runs anything they don't own, for the margins, with her thumb on the scale. She was a sharp, expensive-looking woman in her 40s with a tablet she carried like a clipboard and a smile she deployed like a door closing. The thing about Bianca was that she had figured out something that a lot of property managers figure out, which is that the most profitable tenant is a frightened one. A frightened tenant doesn't dispute a fee. A frightened tenant doesn't read the lease too carefully. A frightened tenant doesn't call the city when the heat goes out, because a frightened tenant has been carefully taught to believe, that they are lucky to be allowed to live here at all, and that any noise they make will end with them on the curb. Bianca specialized in finding the most frightened tenants in the building and squeezing them quietly, steadily, in 100 small ways that never quite crossed the line into something a person could afford to fight. And there was nobody in the Ashgrove more frightened than the single mother in 2C. It started with the fees. A late fee for rent that Della was certain she'd paid on time. And when she checked her bank, she had, but the office had no record, and proving it would mean a fight she didn't have the strength for, so she ate the $40. Then a unit inspection fee. Then a charge for a lease addendum review. Then a notice, slipped under her door in a crisp white envelope, informing her that management has reason to believe the unit may be subject to unauthorized overnight occupancy and or use of common areas and vehicles for habitation, in violation of Lease Section 9 and Municipal Code, and that such violations may be reported to the appropriate authorities, including agencies responsible for the welfare of minor children. Della read that last part standing in her kitchenette at 6 in the evening, and the floor went out from under her. Welfare of minor children. She knew exactly what those words were a knife for. She read it as a threat to take her son, and that is precisely how it was meant to be read. Bianca Reeve had seen the woman sleeping in the car. Bianca Reeve had decided that the woman in the car was either going to start paying every invented fee without a peep, or she was going to be gone, and either outcome was fine, because either outcome was money. What Bianca did not factor in, what people like Bianca never factor in, was that there's a point past which a frightened person stops being frightened and becomes something much harder to manage. Della wasn't there yet, but she was getting close, and the only thing keeping her from coming apart entirely was a thermos of coffee from a person she'd never identified and an hour of chess on a balcony 3 floors up. The morning it all broke open was the kind of morning that makes you forget the year has a warm season in it all. It was the second week of November, a Tuesday, the sky the color of a nickel, the wind coming off the river with teeth in it. Della had worked the night shift, and she had slept her 3 broken hours in the back of the Corolla, and she had just sat up, hair flat on one side, breath fogging, when she saw Bianca Reeve crossing the lot toward her car with a tow truck rolling slow behind her and a man in a long charcoal coat walking at her shoulder. The man was Desmond Pike. Della didn't know his name yet. She'd learn it. He was the regional director for Crestline Property Management, the company that had the contract to run the Ashgrove and a dozen buildings like it. And he was the reason Bianca's little schemes had never been audited, because Bianca's little schemes flowed uphill, and Pike took his cut and asked no questions and signed whatever needed signing. He had come that morning to walk the property and look impressive and approve a list of problem units that Bianca had prepared, and 2C was at the top of it. Bianca had told him there was a woman living in a vehicle on the premises, a liability, a lease violation, a PR risk. Pike liked solving things that made him look decisive. He had told her to handle it while he watched. He had, in fact, suggested they do it now, in the open, so the other residents understand the standard. That was the kind of man Desmond Pike was. Mrs. Marsh. Bianca rapped her knuckle on the fog glass. 2 sharp taps. Mrs. Marsh, I need you to step out of the vehicle. Della came out into the cold in yesterday's clothes, and the humiliation hit her before the words did. The simple animal shame of being found, of being seen sleeping in a car by a woman in a cashmere coat at 7 in the morning. By now, the lot had its early morning population. A handful of tenants heading to work. 2 parents who, like Della, had kids at the elementary school 3 blocks over and who had seen Della at drop-off, who knew her, who knew Theo. Mrs. Okafor with her little dog. And up on the 3rd floor, behind a sliding glass door, a man in a flannel shirt set down his coffee. We've had multiple reports, Bianca said, loud enough to carry, of you living in this vehicle on the property. That's a violation of your lease, and frankly a violation of decency. There are families here, children, and you've got your son up in a unit you can barely afford while you're out here, sleeping in a car. Like, she let the sentence dangle, let the cruelty of it land on its own. Well, I think people can draw their own conclusions about a home like that. I work nights, Della said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. I'm not living in the car. I work the overnight shift downtown, and I park here between jobs, so I don't waste the gas, so I can be here when my son wakes up. So you admit you're using the vehicle for habitation. Bianca said it the way a trap closes. Mr. Pike, you heard her. I heard her, said Desmond Pike in a bored, satisfied voice, and he made a note on his phone that he was not actually writing. The vehicle's being removed, Bianca went on, and we'll be conducting a full review of your tenancy this week, including the matter of who exactly is residing in that unit. You understand I have an obligation. If there's a child being raised in unstable conditions, I'm required to. And that was the word, the second time someone had used the child as a blade, and something in Della Marsh that had been bending for 2 years finally, quietly, stopped bending. She did not yell. She would think about that later, that she didn't yell. She just stood very still in the wind and said, You will not touch my son. That's not your decision, Bianca said. Mom. Every adult in the lot turned. Theo Marsh was standing in the doorway of the building in his pajamas and unlaced sneakers, his constellation book in one hand and Pilot the Owl in the other, his hair standing up, his face white with the particular fear of a child who has come downstairs to find his mother surrounded. He had woken to an empty mattress, which was normal, and then he had heard voices in the lot, which was not, and he had looked out the window and seen his mother standing in the cold being spoken to like that. And he had come down. Now he stood there, frozen, looking at the tow truck hooking up the only other place his family lived, and he did the thing that broke every heart in that parking lot that wasn't already made of stone. He ran to his mother and grabbed her leg and looked up at the woman in the expensive coat and said in a wobbling voice, Please don't take our car. That's where Mom watches the stars. For a moment, nobody said anything. The wind moved. The tow chain clinked. One of the school parents had her hand over her mouth, and Bianca Reeve, who could have been moved by that and chose not to be, looked down at the boy and the owl and the 50-cent book of constellations and said, with a small impatient sigh, Sweetheart, your mother doesn't watch the stars. Your mother sleeps in a parking lot because she can't afford to live indoors. You should know the truth about your own. That's enough. The voice came from behind them, unhurried, quiet, and it had something in it that made even Desmond Pike turned around. The man from 3B had come down. He crossed the lot in his flannel shirt and his work boots, and he stopped between Bianca and the boy, and he looked at the tow operator and said, "Put it down, please. You're not towing anything today." And the strange thing, the thing Della would remember, was that the tow operator looked at this handyman in a flannel shirt and immediately, without a word, started lowering the car. Bianca laughed, a short, incredulous bark. "Adrian, I appreciate the chivalry, but this is a management matter and it does not concern you. So why don't you go back upstairs before I add you to the list of—" Desmond. Adrian wasn't talking to her anymore. He was looking at the man in the charcoal coat, and his voice had changed, had dropped into something flat and certain. "It's been a while. You look well. Crestline's billing me $41,000 a quarter to manage this building, so I'd hope so." Desmond Pike's face did something complicated. I'm sorry, Dove." "You signed a management contract," Adrian said. "Page 1. Owner of record. You've signed 11 of them with my company over 4 years. You just never had a look at the man whose name is on the other side of the table." He let that sit for exactly 1 second. "Adrian Wolf. Wolf Residential. I own the Ashgrove. I own the building you park your nice car in front of. And I've been living in 3B for 5 months, watching how my buildings are actually run when the people running them don't know the owner is watching." The lot went so silent you could hear the river. Bianca Reeves' expensive coat suddenly seemed to be standing up by itself, because the woman inside it had gone hollow. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Desmond Pike had gone the gray of the sky, and Della Marsh stood there with her son clamped to her leg and a stuffed owl staring up at her, looking at the neighbor who fixed bicycle chains and left coffee on her windshield, and the only thing her exhausted, overflowing mind could produce was the small, ridiculous thought. It was him. The whole time. It was him. "Theo," Adrian said gently, crouching down to the boy's level, the same way he had with the bike chain. "Your mom does watch the stars. She's right about that. And nobody is taking her car." He looked up at Della, and there was no pity in his face, which she would understand later was the kindest thing about him. "Go take your boy inside and get him warm. I'll handle this. And then, when you've got a minute, I think you and I should talk. Not about today. About something I'd like you to do for me." That is where the story turns. But it is not where it ends. And if you stop here, you'd miss the best part, which is everything that came after. So stay with me. The truth about Adrian Wolf was not a story he told often, because he had learned that the moment people knew it, they started seeing his money instead of his face. He had grown up in a building exactly like the Ashgrove, in a city 300 miles from here, the only son of a woman named Coraline who had cleaned offices at night. And yes, he had caught the resonance of that the very first time he saw Della's car. And yes, it had hit him somewhere old and unhealed. Coraline Wolf had raised her boy in 2 rooms on a janitor's wages and a waitress's tips, and she had never once let him feel poor, and she had taught him the constellations off a library book because the planetarium cost money they didn't have. When the building they lived in was bought by an out-of-town company, and the new manager started inventing fees and threatening the families who couldn't fight back, Coraline had been one of the ones who couldn't fight back, and they had lost their home in the dead of winter when Adrian was 9, and his mother had carried the shame of it like a stone in her chest until the day she died, far too young, of a heart that had simply worn out from worry. Adrian had clawed his way up through scholarships and software in a decade of 18-hour days, and the moment he had real money, the kind of money that means you never have to be afraid of a white envelope under your door again, he had done something his business partners thought was insane. He had started buying the kind of buildings he'd grown up in, not to flip them, to fix them. And because he had watched, as a boy, exactly how a building gets quietly hollowed out by the people paid to care for it, he did a thing no other landlord of his size did. Every so often, he would move into one of his own buildings under a plain name, in plain clothes, and just live there and watch. He'd find the broken dryer the management company kept billing him to fix and never fixed. He'd find the elderly tenant whose heat request had been lost for times. And he'd find the Bianca Reeves of the world, the ones who had learned to make a profit out of other people's fear, and he would document every bit of it. And then one cold morning he would walk down to the parking lot in his flannel shirt and end it. He had been 3 weeks from finishing his quiet audit of the Ashgrove when he watched a tow truck pull up to a gray Corolla. The boy with the owl had simply moved up his timeline. When Della finally sat down across from him, not that day, but 2 days later, at a corner table in the back of Lou's diner, because Della would not be alone in a room with a man who owned her home, and Adrian understood why and chose the diner himself. She came braced for an offer she had already decided to refuse. She had spent 2 years learning that there was always a catch, that kindness from strangers usually had teeth in it eventually, and she had made up her mind that whatever this man wanted, she would say no, because the one thing she had left that was entirely hers was the fact that she had never taken what she had not earned. "Before you say anything," she said, "I don't want money. I don't want my rent forgiven. I don't want a handout. I don't want you fixing my life because you feel sorry for me or because I remind you of somebody. I'll pay what I owe. I'll pay the fees if I really owe them. I just need you to call off that woman and let me raise my son in peace." She had practiced that in the car. Her voice only shook a little. Adrian Wolfe looked at her for a moment over a cup of Lou's terrible coffee, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not at her, but with something like relief. "Good," he said, "because I wasn't going to offer you any of that." "You weren't." "You don't know a single one of those fees, by the way," he said. "Bianca invented all of them. I've got the records. Your rent's been overcharged by $210 a month against the figure in your actual lease. She pocketed the difference on you and 4 other units I found so far, and I expect there are more. The occupancy violation isn't a real thing in your lease. She made up a section number, and you'd have caught it if you'd been in any state to read carefully, which she counted on. None of that is charity. That's me returning money she stole from you. There's a difference, and I think you of all people understand the difference, which is exactly why I want to talk to you." He set down the cup. "Della, I own 11 buildings, and I'm buying more, and the single hardest problem I have isn't money or maintenance. It's that I cannot be in 11 places at once, and the management companies I hire keep turning into Crestline. I need someone in these buildings who actually knows what it's like to be a tenant in one. Someone who knows what a fabricated fee feels like when you're already scared. Someone who'll notice the woman sleeping in the car before it gets to a tow truck. I'm building something, a resident services program, an advocate in every building, a real one, and I have been looking for the right person to run it for 2 years, and I have not found her." He looked at her steadily. "I think I just found her in a parking lot." Della stared at him. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know if I can." "You worked the front desk and the books at a dental practice for 6 years," he said. "You ran their billing. You're organized, you're calm under pressure, and you've spent the last 2 years learning, the hard way, exactly how the system fails people like you. That's not a resume I can hire. That's a resume life gave you, and it cost you everything, and I am not going to insult it by pretending you'd be doing me a favor by taking the job. You'd be doing the job. I'd be lucky to have you. And the salary," he slid a folded piece of paper across the table, "is what the work is worth, not what your situation is. I won't lowball a person because they're desperate. My mother taught me that mostly by having it done to her." Della unfolded the paper. She looked at the number for a long time. It was a number that meant a real apartment with a door for Theo's room and stars on the ceiling she could put up herself. It was a number that meant never sleeping in the back of a Corolla again. And she felt, sitting in Lou's diner with her chapped hands around a cup, the very specific terror of a person who has wanted something so badly for so long that being offered it feels like a trick. "Why me?" she said. "Really, not the resume, the real reason." Adrian was quiet for a second. Then, "Because when a stranger told your son the truth was that his mother slept in a parking lot, your son didn't get embarrassed. He defended you. He said you watched the stars. A kid only does that if his mother built him something real out of nothing. If she took the worst thing in both your lives and turned it into a thing he's proud of." He looked away, out the diner window at the gray street. "My mother did that for me. Nobody ever paid her back for it. I can't pay her back, but I can hire the next woman who's doing it and pay her what she's worth, and that's the closest thing to justice I've ever been able to buy. So, that's the real reason. Take the weekend. Talk to your boy." She didn't need the weekend, but she took it anyway, because she was not a woman who made decisions while her hand was shaking. She talked to Theo that night, lying on the mattress with a rocket flashlight on the ceiling, and she told him a careful, true-size version. That the nice man from upstairs, the one who knew all the constellations, had offered her a real job. A good one. Helping other families who were having a hard time like they had a hard time. Theo considered this with the gravity of a small judge. "Does it mean you'll be home at night?" he asked. That was the only question that mattered to him. When she said yes, he nodded once, satisfied, and said, "Good. The stars are boring without you anyway," and fell asleep against her shoulder, and Della lay awake in the dark for a long time, looking up at a ceiling that didn't have any stars on it yet, and let herself, for the first time in 2 years, feel something dangerously close to hope. She took the job on Monday, and that is when Bianca Reeve and Desmond Pike, who had spent the weekend not feeling sorry but feeling cornered, decided to fight. Here is a thing about people like Bianca and Desmond. When they're caught, their first instinct is never to repent. It's to find a story in which they are the victim. Over that weekend, the two of them had constructed exactly such a story. And it went like this: that Adrian Wolfe had lost his judgment over a pretty tenant, that he'd been manipulated by a hard-luck single mother who'd targeted him, and that handing her a do-nothing job at a salary like that was either a scandal or a liability, or both. They could not undo the fact that Adrian owned the building, but they could poison the water. They could make sure that when Adrian Wolfe tried to clean house at Crestline, the story that got there first was the story of a wealthy man and the woman from the parking lot. And they had spent enough years in this industry to know that a story like that, properly placed, sticks to the woman and never to the man. Pike still had the management contract for the Ashgrove and 10 other buildings, and he wasn't going to lose all of that without a fight. So he requested a meeting, a formal one, with Wolfe Residential's investors and the building's homeowners' representatives and a lawyer dressed up as a transition and compliance review, but really a venue to do one thing: to stand up in front of everyone who mattered and frame Della Marsh as a problem before Adrian could frame Crestline as a thief. Bianca prepared a binder. She was good at binders. It had photographs of the Corolla, the fabricated occupancy notice presented as if it were legitimate, a timeline of concerns about Unit 2C, and a careful, lawyerly insinuation that the owner's new hire raised questions of judgment and propriety. The plan was simple and old as money: get there first and make the victim look like the villain. What they didn't know was that Della Marsh had spent 6 years running the billing for a dental practice, which is to say she had spent 6 years building, maintaining, and cross-referencing records, and she was about to put that skill to a use Crestline had never imagined. And what they really didn't know was that the quiet handyman in 3B had spent 5 months doing the same. The meeting was held on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room downtown, all glass and pale wood, and a long table that had been designed to make people feel small. Desmond Pike arrived first and arranged himself at the far end with his lawyer and his binder and the particular confidence of a man who believes he has set the table. Bianca sat beside him in a fresh, expensive coat. There were investors, a homeowner's representative, 2 attorneys for Wolfe Residential, and, sitting quietly near the door, in the only chair that wasn't leather, Della Marsh in the one good outfit she owned, with a folder of her own on her knee. She had been told she didn't have to come. She had said she'd rather be in the room. Adrian had looked at her for a second and then said, "Yeah, you should be," and that was that. Pike opened the way men like Pike always open, with warmth and concern and the slow knife. He spoke about the long, productive relationship between Crestline and Wolfe Residential. He spoke about his obligation to flag concerns, even uncomfortable ones, especially uncomfortable ones. He spoke about the unusual circumstances of a recent hire, about the optics, about his worry, his deep, performed worry, that the owner's personal involvement with a vulnerable tenant had clouded an otherwise sound operation. And he slid the binder down the table, and he watched the faces around it the way Bianca watched a frightened tenant, looking for the flinch. And here is the moment the whole thing turned, because nobody flinched. Adrian Wolfe let Pike finish. Let him get all the way to the end of his careful, poisonous little speech. And then he said, mildly, "Are you done, Desmond? Good. Then I'd like the room to hear from the person you've spent 10 minutes talking about, as if she weren't sitting right there." And he looked at Della, and he said, "Mrs. Marsh, whenever you're ready." Della Marsh stood up. Her knees were not entirely steady, but her voice, when it came, was she did not raise it. She had learned from a master, although she didn't know it yet. She had learned it from a woman in a parking lot who never raised hers either. "My name is Della Marsh," she said. "I'm the woman in the binder. I'm going to tell you what's actually in it because Mr. Pike presented it as a record of my failures, and it's not. It's a record of theirs." She opened her own folder. "These are my bank statements for the last 7 months. Every rent payment, on time, every one. This is my lease, my real lease, with the rent figure circled. This is the figure Crestline charged me, $210 higher, every month, into an account that does not appear on any statement Wolf Residential receives. This is the late fee I was charged for a payment that cleared on the 1st. This is the occupancy violation notice citing lease section 9, and this," she held up the lease, "is lease section 9. It's about parking permits. There is no occupancy clause in my lease. Ms. Reeve invented one to frighten me into either paying or leaving, because a frightened tenant is a profitable tenant, and I was the most frightened tenant in the building." She set the papers down. "I was the most frightened tenant in the building because I was sleeping in my car so my son could have a bed. And I want to be very clear about something, because Ms. Reeve said it in front of my child and I have not been able to stop hearing it. Sleeping in that car was not a thing that happened to me. It was a thing I chose, the way you choose it, the way any of you would every single night on purpose so that one 7-year-old could wake up warm. I'm not ashamed of it. I was never ashamed of it. The only person in this story who should be ashamed is the one who looked at a mother doing that and saw a way to make $40. The room was very quiet. Della sat down. Then Adrian opened his own folder. It was a great deal thicker than Pike's, and the afternoon stopped being a venue for a story about a woman and became a forensic accounting of a theft. 5 months of documentation. The fabricated fees across 9 units, not 5. He kept looking. The overcharges skimmed into an account that traced, in the end, to a shell company with Desmond Pike's brother-in-law's name on it. The maintenance work Crestline had billed Wolf Residential for and never performed, building after building, a pattern going back 4 years and totaling, when the attorneys finished adding it up that week, somewhere north of $600,000. The lost heat requests from elderly tenants in 3 different buildings. The whole quiet machine of it, laid out on pale wood, with photographs and invoices and bank records, until Desmond Pike's lawyer leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and Desmond Pike stopped talking entirely, which for Desmond Pike was the most eloquent thing he did all day. Crestline's contract with Wolf Residential was terminated that afternoon, all 11 buildings, effective immediately. The documentation was referred to the State Attorney General's office and to the city's housing authority within the week. Bianca Reeve, who had spent 2 years making a profit out of fear, discovered that the floor under fear is not actually very solid once someone with resources decides to push back, and she spent the following months giving the kind of careful, lawyered statements that people give when the only remaining question is how much trouble they're in. None of it made the news in any way that touched Della. Adrian made sure of that. He had not protected his own mother's name from the shame of an eviction, and he was not going to let a single headline attach the word scandal to the woman who reminded him of her. The story stayed where it belonged, on the people who'd earned it. And then, the way the world does, things got quietly ordinarily good. The resident services program that Adrian had been describing for 2 years stopped being a description. Della Marsh built it. She built it out of everything the last 2 years had taught her, which turned out to be a curriculum no business school offers. She knew, because she had lived it, that the most important thing a struggling tenant needs is not money but information. To know the fee is fake, to know the clause isn't real, to know the heat is a right and not a favor, to know that somebody in the building is on their side and cannot be bribed into looking away. She set up an advocate in every building. She built a system, with her dental billing precision, that flagged a fabricated charge the moment it appeared, so no future Bianca could ever again make a quiet living off a frightened family. She was, it turned out, extraordinary at it, in the way that people are sometimes extraordinary at the exact thing that once nearly destroyed them. The first thing she did with her first real paycheck was not move. People expected her to move. She didn't, not far anyway. She moved Theo up to a real one-bedroom on the fourth floor of the Ashgrove, the same building, because Theo had friends there now and a man upstairs who played chess with him, and because Della had decided that the Ashgrove was not going to be the place where she was humiliated. It was going to be the place where she got her life back, and she wanted to live inside that fact. The new apartment had a real bedroom for Theo with a window facing east. The second thing she did the very first weekend, before the furniture was even fully in, was stand on a chair with a bag of glow-in-the-dark stars and put Orion's belt on her son's ceiling, straight, the way his father used to, and Cassiopeia, and the Big Dipper, and she made him close his eyes until the lights were off, and then told him to open them. And Theo looked up at his own private sky and was quiet for a long time, and then said, "Now you don't have to go to the parking lot to see them." And Della, on the chair in the dark, had to wait a minute before she could trust her voice to say, "No, baby, I don't have to go anywhere." She never did sleep in the car again. The Corolla sat in the lot like an old friend who'd survived something with you. And Theo asked once if they could keep it forever, and Della said yes, and they did. Adrian Wolf did not move out of 3B for another 2 months, and when he did, it was only across the hall to a slightly larger unit because, and he was almost embarrassed to admit this to himself, he had stopped wanting to be anonymous. He had spent 15 years building a life designed to keep people at the distance of his money, and he had moved into the Ashgrove to watch a building and had ended up, against every plan he'd ever made, being seen. Not as a landlord, not as a checkbook, just as Adrian, who knew the constellations and fixed bicycle chains and lost at chess to a 7-year-old on purpose about half the time. He kept losing on purpose. The boy was starting to figure it out, which was, Adrian thought, exactly when you were supposed to stop. The thing between Adrian and Della took its time, the way the best things do when both people have already learned what it costs to rush. There was no dramatic scene, no rain, no declaration. There was a year of him being a steady, reliable presence at the edge of their small family. A Sunday dinner that became a standing Sunday dinner. A parent-teacher conference he was quietly proud to be invited to. 100 ordinary evenings on a balcony with a telescope he'd bought for Theo that the three of them used together until the cold drove them in. There was the slow, careful work of two guarded people deciding, separately and then together, that they were safe. Della had buried a husband she loved, and she did not give her trust away twice without being certain. Adrian had spent his whole life suspecting the motives of anyone who got close, and had to learn that this woman had, quite literally, tried to refuse him before she knew who he was. By the time anything was said out loud, almost nothing needed to be. It was less a beginning than a quiet acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long while, and they kept it gentle, and they kept it slow, and most of all they kept it real, which after everything was the only way either of them knew how to keep anything anymore. It is a Tuesday in October, almost exactly 1 year from the morning of the tow truck, when this story finds its last image. The Ashgrove has a flat roof that Adrian had cleared and railed and turned, with a permit and a contractor he actually paid, into a small rooftop garden for the tenants, with benches and planters and a clear view of the sky over the rooftops. It is cold up there, the first real cold of the year, the kind that used to mean a long night in a metal box, and now means nothing worse than reaching for a sweater. The telescope is set up near the railing. Theo, 8 now, and an inch taller, and an absolute tyrant about bedtime extensions when there is anything worth seeing in the sky, has his eye to the lens, and is narrating the rings of Saturn to anyone who will listen, which tonight is everyone, because Lou from the diner is up there too, and Mrs. Okafor with her little dog, and 3 other families from the building, all of them looking up. Della stands at the railing with a thermos of coffee. A good one now, not Lou's terrible one, though she'd never say so to Lou. And she's looking not at the sky, but at her son, at the back of his head bent over a telescope on the roof of the building where a woman once told him his mother didn't watch the stars. Adrian comes to stand beside her, close but not crowding, the way he has always stood near her, and he follows her gaze to the boy and says nothing, because by now silence between them is a place they can both stand without needing to fill it. After a while, Theo straightens up from the telescope and turns around and finds them in the dark, and his whole face opens in that unguarded way children have before the world teaches them to be careful with their happiness. "Mom," he says, "Adrian, come look. You have to come look. You can see the rings, they're right there." And he waves them over with both arms, the constellation book sticking out his coat pocket, and Pilot the owl wedged under one elbow. And Della Marsh, who slept in a car for 7 months so that this child could be warm, walks across a rooftop under the actual sky, toward the actual stars. And her son grabs her hand and pulls her down to the eyepiece, and somewhere in the cold and the dark, and the small, ordinary warmth of it, the thing that has been moving toward this point for a long time, finally, quietly, simply arrives. She had told him, once on the worst nights, "When you can't see me, look up. I'm looking at the same sky. That's how you know I'm close." She doesn't have to say it anymore. She's right there beside him. They both are. And they're all, every one of them on that roof, looking up. If the story moved you, if you believe that the people the world overlooks are so often the strongest ones in the room, and that quiet dignity is its own kind of power, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. We post stories like this one every week about ordinary people who refuse to be made small and the moments when the world finally has to see them. Leave a comment and tell me, what did you think Adrian was going to do when he stepped out of that apartment? I read every one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. It means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.